One nation, indivisible. Most living Americans have said those words at least once, hands over their heart in a solemn pledge of allegiance to the single most powerful nation on earth. But ask those same Americans, and most are likely to agree that it has been a very long time since America has been truly indivisible. And since then, it's been bitterness, polarization, and grand divides that seem to grow deeper every day. When people refer to the Great American Experiment, they call it an experiment for a reason. First 13 and now 50 distinct states with distinct cultures, distinct economies, distinct politics, and today at least several 100,000 people to call them home, all joining together to become a nation greater than the sum of its parts, yet staying true to themselves at the same time. That experiment wasn't simply in theory, and it certainly hasn't been simple in practice. Many states have considered leaving at many different times, and the nation even fought a civil war over the question. Some states, like Texas or California, still talk of secession today, and it's increasingly common to hear Americans wonder whether they still share one nation after all. But what would actually happen if the United States of America did decide that the Grand American Experiment had finally failed? What would happen if this one nation of 50 states decided to break apart into two nations or three or more? Which states would join together? Which of these new nations would stand best chance at survival? And what really happens next to a United States that's decided it isn't so united anymore? Now, the most obvious way to divide the United States is the one that sounds the simplest on paper. Take America's 50 states, its 3.8 million square miles and its population of 340 million, and split them in two. And that's the solution that would mirror America's most obvious divide right now, the combination of political, cultural, economic, and geographic fault lines that have split the United States into red and blue, right and left, liberal and conservative. It's an imperfect distinction, to be sure, and there are millions of Americans who might not easily align with one side or the other, or might feel as if they're not represented by either side. But in broad strokes, this is the single greatest divide in American life, an intensely bitter, hyper-polarized debate in which neither side seems particularly interested in reconciliation. To divide the United States into two new nations, that's an idea that's grown more and more popular as the years go by. According to one survey by the University of Virginia in 2021, around half of all people who had voted for Donald Trump in America's 2020 election, and around 40% of those who'd voted for Joe Biden, agreed with the idea that it was time for America's red states and its blue states to split. Last year, a survey of Americans by Ipsos found that over 80% of Americans, including 80% or more of polled Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, believe that the United States is more divided than it is united, with almost the same number agreeing that the country is more divided today than it was a decade ago. Neither of America's dominant political parties draw anywhere near an approval rating of 50%, with only about 25 to 35% approval for Democrats, according to a 2025 poll, and not much better for the Republicans. Passionate thinkers on both sides of the political aisle frequently explore the idea of a national divorce in books and think pieces that often draw quite a bit of support, and even elected officials have called for it in recent years. It's helpful, from an analytical perspective, to explore the idea of a simple, straightforward American national breakup for a couple of reasons. First, it's the easiest to imagine, and while it's not anywhere near being unanimously agreed on by the American public, it's not particularly difficult to understand the side of the gap where a given person would end up. Partly because people with similar belief systems about political structures will tend to ally together, and partly because people who are in the process of allying together tend to homogenize their belief systems to a degree, so it's surprisingly easy to predict an American voter's whole belief system based on just a few pieces of starting information. A person who lives in Brooklyn, who regularly attends pro-abortion marches and makes $130,000 a year, is also a person who probably supports restrictions on firearms, opposes mass deportations, supports the legalization of cannabis, and opposes the idea of placing restrictions on gay or transgender Americans. A person who lives in rural Montana, who attends church every Sunday and makes $48,000 a year and owns 5 firearms, is a person who probably supports the use of the death penalty in murder cases, opposes the teaching of critical race theory in schools, supports efforts to downsize the federal government, and opposes initiatives to curtail the funding of local police forces. And again, these are not a series of rules that will always hold true. The American electorate is a massive, diverse, complicated beast, and if you were to mix and match quite literally any combination of discord and political beliefs, we guarantee you that there's at least one person out there with that personal belief system. But for the most part, Americans will self-sort fairly painlessly into either the political left or the political right. So if a national divorce simply creates a nation to represent each group, then it's easy to predict the nation that a given person would prefer. But the second reason that we explore a clean partisan split of the United States first is that it's a pretty bad idea in practice. Of course, there's the basic reasoning that dictates why any breakup of a country is probably a bad idea. That's an act that tends to either be followed by or happen because of a civil war, and the last time the United States tried, about 700,000 soldiers from both sides and probably multiple hundreds of thousands of civilians died as a result. But even beyond that, a half-and-half split of the United States would come with countless problems, and to understand those problems, we got to start with geography. Take a look at the map of state-by-state results from America's 2024 elections, and the issue should be readily apparent very quickly. Now, the band of territory controlled by the American right, and thus the territory that would end up as part of the new conservative nation we're inventing, is relatively contiguous, spread across the continental United States in the rough shape of a letter S flipped onto its side. It runs from the southwest to the northern plains, down the Tornado Belt to Texas, and then the deep south through the Appalachian Mountain Range, and finally the historical manufacturing states to the south of the Great Lakes. The American left, by contrast, and thus their new country, have the entire west coast, the northern half of the east coast, a two-state block in the center-west of the country, and a pair of states isolated by themselves, Minnesota and Illinois. To put it simply, you can't make your country out of that. Wind back the clock by 4 years. The problem changes, but it doesn't get any better. The American left gets the west coast and much of the southwest, several states around the Great Lakes, slightly more of the upper east coast, and the lone state of Georgia, while the American right gets a sprawling blob of mostly uninterrupted land, with all states sharing a border. Again, any pair of countries you could make out of that map would be very strange indeed. US states do not cluster in neat geographical areas like they cluster on different sides of a partisan divide. And while geographic features like urban versus rural makeup, resource access, and more will inform a state's political leanings, that hasn't resulted in a map that makes any degree of sense for nation building. Factors that dictated the geographical divide of America's Civil War in the 1960s, like the Mason-Dixon line, as a marker to denote free states to the north and slave states to the south, just haven't lasted into the modern day. And the fact that there's such a change in the maps between 2020 and 2024 points at a much more fundamental reality that stops a two-way divide from being realistic. No US state is an ideological monolith. Even the most conservative states have liberal populations, and even the most liberal states have their fair share of conservative residents. In nearly a dozen states, the divide is so close to being 50-50 that they'll flop back and forth from favoring the right to favoring the left, and vice versa from election to election. What that means is that any act of separation of the United States into two sides would mean that tens of millions of people immediately start out in the wrong country. That's not an unheard of situation in world history, with minority populations forced to either relocate or fend for themselves, but it's not a situation that tends to resolve peacefully. For one particularly salient example, we can look at the partition of British India into India and Pakistan in 1947, a process that displaced somewhere between 12 and 20 million people, and that left as many as 2 million, or possibly even more, lying dead by the time it was all over. A similar approach to the United States would leave millions dead if it turned violent, with fatality rates increased substantially by the availability of consumer and military-grade firearms all across the country, and both of North America's new nations would be recovering from the damage and the influx of internally displaced refugees for decades. From there, the practical impact of breaking the United States in half just gets worse and worse. For one thing, a successful breakup would mean that the US military would have to be divided peacefully, without taking part in hostilities or working to reimpose federal order. 1.3 million active-duty military members would have to be split up, as well as the assets of the most powerful Army, Navy, and Air Force on the planet, and thousands of nuclear warheads, thus creating a new nation with a massive nuclear arsenal. The same could be said for the US economy, a vast interconnected web of capital and resources that's been built and expanded on the premise that America's states are interreliant. Raw materials grown or mined in one state are processed in another before being sent to another state in order to be transformed into a usable product. That product is sold in turn across a whole range of other states and exported to other nations using the ports of still other states. How those networks could remain stable in a nation that's dividing and quite possibly in a state of internal conflict is anybody's guess. And what's to be done with the institutions of the modern American federal government? Are they supposed to simply be handed over to whichever state controls the land on which they're situated? Or what happens to Washington, D.C. or America's overseas territories? What happens to its bank accounts and its assets in orbit or in cyberspace? Now, in fairness to the portion of the American public that's prone to throwing their hands up and exclaiming that it's about damn time that the country was split in half, it's not hard to see how they get there. Amidst all the partisanship, all the bitterness, and all the political upheaval of modern America, a two-way split in an ideal world would seem as if it could solve a lot of problems. In reality, however, the circumstances that would allow for a clean break just do not exist. So, if we're going to find a better way, then we need to start getting creative. Okay, when we start looking at ways to divide the United States that might not lead to a complete catastrophe, we can start by holding to a couple of rules. First, whatever nation-states that come out of this whole thing have to make geographical sense as a contiguous landmass. Second, we'll accomplish that task by using the existing borders of existing states rather than trying to rewrite American geography in its totality. Third, we're not going to prohibit new nations that would incorporate both red and blue states. As we've mentioned, it's not practical to do that, and even if we did, we'd still have minority populations in every state. Fourth, and most important of all, we're going to assume that because we're dividing into more than two nations, this is going to be some sort of managed breakup of territory instead of one in which America's two political factions, already incapable of working with each other, simply try to gobble up territory and assets as fast as they can. The precise divides and allocations of certain states into a series of smaller nations are a matter of debate, and we'll talk through a series of proposals in just a little while. But before we do that, we're going to lay out a map of our own that we can use as a starting point. To do it, we're going to break up the United States into a group of 6 sovereign nations per the reasoning that we're about to lay out. To be clear, our objective is not to propose a single correct solution. Quite frankly, we are far from convinced in our own right that there's any good way to do this. But we can at least give ourselves a decent starting point before we move into deeper levels of analysis. Starting with America's west coast, we've got a nation comprising the 3 coastal states, California, Oregon, and Washington, plus the inland states of Nevada and Arizona, and the island archipelago state of Hawaii. On the opposite coast, we'll lump together the states of the American Northeast into a new country, the 6 states of New England, plus New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. The American Deep South becomes its own nation, out to the west edge of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri, where it runs into a new nation made up of Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. We do the same for the states surrounding the Great Lakes, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota, with West Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa added for good measure. And finally, the states of the northwestern plains and Rocky Mountains from their own state, comprising Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Utah, and Colorado, as well as the exclave of Alaska, because really it just feels a bit unfair that the West Coast nations should get both Alaska and Hawaii to themselves. The breakup of these 6 nations is meant to balance a few factors at once. Each of them is meant to be at least relatively politically homogenous. The Northeast and West Coast nations are made up of states that usually vote blue. The Deep South and Lower Central nations are mostly made up of states that vote red. And the Great Lakes nation has a couple of consistent blues, a couple of consistent reds, and several swing states. And while the landlocked Northwestern nation includes blue Colorado in an otherwise red group, we trust the people hailing from this area can confirm that the vibes tend to align decently despite the political differences. All but one of the new nations has access to seaports, either directly or through the St. Lawrence River. Each of them are relatively homogeneous in geography, climate, and biome, and each of them come with their own major urban centers, their own natural resources, their own decently connected infrastructure, and their own relatively distinct regional economies. Now, obviously, there is plenty of room for debate in this hypothetical scenario to shift a state here or a state there into a different new nation than the one we've assigned it to, but we'd rather not spend this entire episode debating the finer points. A carefully managed split into new nations like these could make it considerably easier to split up the assets of the United States from the top down. While it would still be a massive logistical challenge, the US military could be split into smaller fighting forces and based using pre-existing infrastructure in each of these 6 nations. Each of them as urban centers that already host large state-level governments, and other, even larger urban centers like Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, or New York City that could conceivably become the new seat of a federal government. While not all of the new nations have the agricultural or industrial capacity to completely support themselves, that's true of a wide range of world nations, and most of them have the requisite seaports to import goods they have to bring in from overseas, while the one landlocked nation could work out deals with any of the 3 new nations that border it, or Canada. Each of these new nations have enough cultural commonality to find their way to the basis of a new national identity, and while each of them would likely form new political groups to represent ideological splits within their population, none of those new populations should be expected to be nearly so polarized as the current United States taken together as it exists today. But even with the benefit of well-defined geographical, ideological, and economic borders, and with the benefits of a more carefully managed transition, many of the problems of a two-way split still haven't been solved. While there may not be quite so many people stuck in a place that they feel doesn't represent their interests or their preferred way of life, that problem will exist in any of the petitioning scenarios that we discuss. Distributing the wealth and assets of the United States, especially assets not tied to geography, will be a long and difficult process, but there would also be a range of new problems to contend with. In a 6-way split like the one that we've described, there will be disparity in outcomes, especially with areas like the modern American Deep South that struggles with high poverty rates, or areas like the landlocked Northwest that struggle with low population and minimal built infrastructure. Systems that currently redistribute wealth across the United States, with wealth from richer areas going to prop up and support poorer areas, will be dismantled, leaving the unluckier of these new nations without many options except to go through a difficult and risky transition period. And while the short-term risk of conflict may be lower in the event of a 6-way breakup than it was in a straight partisan split, the long-term risk of conflict could be far higher. In geopolitical terms, a solution like this could be called balkanization, that is to say, fragmenting a large nation into smaller and sometimes bitterly opposed nations like the Balkans of Europe, notorious for a modern history of chaos and ethnic conflict. While the tension points in a divided ex-America would be different than those of the Balkans, we'd still be watching 6 newly formed nations try to live alongside each other after having been divided in a way that will most likely set them on divergent political paths. What does it mean for this new system when, let's say, one of the states goes darkly authoritarian, even totalitarian, and starts picking a fight with its squishy, highly democratic neighbor? What does it mean when, let's say, that rural and relatively impoverished northwestern nation starts leaning on a powerful foreign ally like China for support when its next-door neighbor on the Great Lakes, a resurgent manufacturing powerhouse, is directly competing with China on the global stage? And what does it mean when nuclear weapons and advanced military equipment have been divided equally among all 6? Does that deter future conflicts, or raise the likelihood that some disputes between any 2 of these 6 neighbor nations could spiral into World War III? Of course, our 6-state solution for the United States is far from the only solution to be proposed for a great American divorce, and any proposal will come with its potential benefits as well as its potential drawbacks. So instead of just throwing out our own strange invention and treating it as gospel rather than a thought experiment, we can turn toward the great big world of divided America maps and see what else is out there. And we'll start with a Vox article from all the way back in 2015, spotlighting the surprisingly meticulous work of a Redditor under the screen name of Hormizdis. They went about dividing the United States in a number of different iterations, with population as the most important factor. A map that split the United States 5 ways, based on 2010 census data, and made each new nation roughly the same population size as the UK, gave us a Northeast nation, a Deep South nation, and a Great Lakes nation similar to the ones in our 6-state solution, plus an expanded West Coast nation. But it also created a gigantic Middle American nation, all the way from Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, and most of Minnesota in the north, to New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana in the south. An 8-way divide ended up with California as its own nation, next to a massive stretch of land including part or all of 19 of America's states, including some of the largest. Even further back in time, in 2010, a map by blogger Pete Warden gave some interesting ideas based on data collected from 210 million public Facebook profiles. Using that data, Warden allowed the United States to self-sort into nations based on social networking instead of geography alone. Taking that data and turning it into nations would have created a long, thin, sovereign Mormon state, a small nation at the tip of the Pacific Northwest, a nation that today comprises Southern California, and a massive nation stretching all the way from New England to Missouri to the Dakotas. A similar map, made by the geographer and futurist Joel Kotkin, divided America into sevenths and included geographical oddities like thin coastal nations along both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, while also making the unusual and almost sacrilegious decision to split Texas into 3 parts. And then there's the historical approach, something that author and historian Colin Woodard tackled in 2011 in a book called American Nations. In that book, Woodard divides the modern United States into a total of 11 distinct cultures, each with their own long histories and modern distinctions from any of their companions across the United States. The book discusses cultures like the highly educated communal Yankeedom, with its roots in New England's Puritan settlements, but today accounting for not just New England, but Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and more. It discusses the New Netherlands, a highly multicultural and capitalistic society with its roots in the Dutch settlement of the Mid-Atlantic, and today comprising New York City and the surrounding region. It discusses the originally Spanish-settled El Norte, comprising Southern California, West Texas, and parts of several other American and Mexican states, as well as New France, a diasporic region that links southern Louisiana with much of the Canadian provinces of Quebec. While it would be very difficult to turn those cultures into modern nations, they do get at a really important question. If you're going to open Pandora's box and divide the United States into new countries with their own cultures, then how far do you go? Some thinkers have even tried to make a 2-state divide work on a practical level. In 2018, conservative author Jesse Kelly constructed a spidery map that separated predominantly progressive and predominantly conservative areas from each other, something that a mapmaker named Dick and Schrader would expand upon in order to make a really strange but oddly functional geographical monstrosity. The end result was a pair of nations that somehow each remained contiguous, meaning that all parts touched each other and a person could navigate through them without ever passing into the other nation, using pre-existing interstate highway connections to address the most sensitive areas. Every nation has access to both coasts and the American Gulf, and while the conservative nation gets twice the landmass of the progressive nation gets twice the population, with each of them getting several major cities out of the deal. More recently, other people have tooled around with dividing the United States based on anything from its natural watersheds to its various religious or anti-religious theocracies, to its power grids, to its logistical transportation infrastructure. Still others have reignited old proposals for individual state secession, like in California or Texas, or for making Alaska part of Canada rather than part of the US. And finally, there's the most balkanized solution of all, taking every US state and simply making them into their own country, from what would be the 3rd largest economy in the world behind only China and Germany, California, to the state with the smallest economy, Vermont, roughly equivalent to that of Nepal, Paraguay, or Estonia. But look, no matter the specifics, no matter the number of nations that we end up with, all of these partition plans for the United States share one thing in common. There are no guarantees that any of them could actually work, and there are certainly no guarantees that any of them would be better than the situation that the US is currently dealing with. There are still reasons to at least consider a great American breakup, and although a fair proportion of Americans would object on the basis that you simply can't create a better system than what America has right now, it's worth asking whether that position is just simply a matter of bias. After all, the fully realized United States of America have grown into the most powerful nation on Earth, and it's easy to look at that outcome and assume that there couldn't possibly have been a better way, even though we don't actually know that, seeing as it hasn't been tried. There is a decent argument to be made that a well-managed breakup could actually serve the interests of the people who currently live in a unified America. It's not that every idea could work. Some of them, just like trying to cut the USA into 2 halves based on its partisan divide, are a recipe for complete and total disaster. But writing off every proposal to divide the US simply because it divides the US doesn't make sense either. In a historical sense, it's practically impossible to claim that America's founding fathers could have foreseen what their nation has become, with 50 individual, powerful political entities working together as relative equals in a federal system with dozens of major metropolitan centers, a wildly diversified modern economy, and roughly 136 times the population of America's 13 colonies in 1776. The United States bears absolutely no resemblance to the colonial empires of their time, and it's expanded into its new territory in a way that's practically nothing like the way that territorial expansion worked in the late 18th century. The United States has outgrown the parameters of its original founding documents in myriad ways, partly as shown by the repeated and extensive reinterpretation and the occasional amendment of those founding documents. If a constitution ratified in 1790 has been so extensively updated and reinterpreted in order to stay relevant to the United States in 2025, then why shouldn't America's geographical makeup do the same? And if we step away from focusing on outcomes for everyone in order to focus exclusively on outcomes for specific groups of people, a great American breakup would objectively be better for some of the nations that come out of it. Take the state of California, currently contributing so much to the American federal government that it helps to prop up several other states at once. Take California out of America's federal system, put it into a new nation with other donor states like Oregon and Washington, with which it can form a landmass, and give it exclusive dominion over America's west coast, and, well, the results are pretty clear, aren't they? That would obviously create a nation that is more wealthy and powerful per capita than any of those states currently are as contributors to America's federal government. The problems with those kind of plans come from the effects that such a divide would have on everybody else. Regions like the Deep South or the landlocked Northwest that are dependent on America's federal system in order to stay afloat. But approach the question as a matter of self-interest, and it should be no surprise that the nations of the West Coast or other groups of donor states like New York, Pennsylvania, and the states of New England could see real opportunity in the prospect of charting a more independent course. But is there a way to partition the United States into new nations when nobody is getting screwed in the end? Is there a way to serve every part of today's United States better by saying goodbye to the grand American experiment and allowing a new collection of smaller nations to pursue futures all their own? Are there ways to break up the US while preventing the outbreak of future wars, preventing mass resettlement crises, and ensuring that all of these new nations will be economically viable? And after the confusion, the debate, and the short-term pain of a great American breakup, is there a way to build a finished result that leaves everybody better off in the end? For now, that is a question that nobody can answer, and the United States of America, where the two sides of a political divide are so starkly opposed that they're asking about a national breakup, probably isn't a United States that's actually capable of pulling it off. Sure, there might be some way to make a truly successful partition happen, but that's only if the people of the modern United States can work together productively for long enough and in great enough detail to divide their nation up. If America's national divorce stands any chance of being a clean, amicable breakup, then that's what it would take. Real, intensive collaboration across the aisle at the state, local, and federal levels to responsibly manage one of the most complex decisions in American history, and also the last decision in American history. If that sounds like a challenge that today's United States is ready for, then fair enough. But you'd have to have a hell of a lot more faith in American bipartisanship than we do. Thank you for watching.